Josephine clutched her tote bag tighter as the automatic doors of the airport slid open, releasing a blast of cool, air-conditioned relief. The chaos of the terminal hit her all at once. An ocean of voices, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, the occasional bark of a gate agent over the PA system. It was a symphony of organized turmoil, and she was already late. The email had come through less than 6 hours earlier. A rare artifact had been discovered in a small museum across the country, and her expertise was needed immediately. Josephine had scrambled to pack and arrange for someone to cover her responsibilities at her own museum, all while fielding a flurry of emails from her director. Now, running on caffeine and adrenaline, she zigzagged through the terminal, searching for Gate 37. She spotted it ahead, a cluster of passengers milling around, some seated and scrolling through their phones, others standing in impatient clusters near the counter. A digital display overhead read, Flight 1745 to Portland, Bortling. Josephine exhaled in relief and joined the end of the line. Her curls were starting to escape from the clip she'd hastily thrown them into that morning, and she smoothed a hand over them absently. She glanced at her boarding pass for the 10th time, silently willing the check-in process to go smoothly. She couldn't afford delays, not with the artifact waiting for her. When she reached the front of the line, the young agent behind the counter barely made eye contact as he scanned her ticket. His cheerful demeanor faltered as he frowned at the screen. Ms. Hayes, he said, glancing up at her. Yes, she replied, her heart skipping a beat. I'm so sorry, but it looks like the flight is overbooked. We're asking for volunteers to take the next available flight tomorrow morning. Josephine froze. Tomorrow? No, I can't do that. I absolutely have to be on this flight. The agent offered an apologetic smile, though his eyes were already darting back toward the growing line of waiting passengers. Unfortunately, the airline can't guarantee. I have a ticket, a confirmed seat. Josephine's voice sharpened, but she caught herself, softening her tone. Traveling was stressful, sure, but the agent wasn't the enemy here. Is there anything you can do? I really need to get to Portland tonight. Before he could respond, a commotion to her left drew her attention. Another man had stepped up to the counter, his voice low but firm. I'm sorry, but there's been some mistake, he was saying, holding up his own boarding pass. He was tall, with sandy brown hair that flopped slightly over his forehead, and his expression was serious but calm. I booked this seat a week ago. The agent's face went pale as he glanced between the 2 tickets now in his hand. It seems there's been a mix-up. Both of you are assigned to the same seat. Josephine blinked at him, then at the man beside her. What? She said, her voice rising in disbelief. The man, Daniel, if his neatly printed boarding pass was to be believed, met her gaze apologetically. I was just told the same thing, he said. His tone was quiet, careful, as though he were trying not to make the situation worse. Josephine's stomach churned. She didn't have time for this. Look, she said, glancing between Daniel and the agent, I appreciate that mistakes happen, but there has to be a solution. There's no way I can wait until tomorrow. Daniel raised a brow, clearly about to protest his own case, when another agent hurried over to whisper something to the first. After a moment, they both straightened. There is one option, the first agent said hesitantly. It's unconventional, but if the two of you are willing... The agent trailed off, his uncertain gaze bouncing between Josephine and Daniel. Josephine pinched the bridge of her nose, trying to beat back the whirlwind of frustration in her chest. She was exhausted, she was late, and now she was stuck in some absurd standoff over a seat on a plane. Beside her, the man, Daniel, she reminded herself, shifted his weight, his ticket still clutched in his hand. He hadn't spoken much, but his quiet presence was irritating her more than she cared to admit. What exactly are you suggesting? Josephine asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The agent hesitated, clearly bracing himself. Well, we do have one first-class seat available. It wasn't assigned because of a canceled reservation. If the two of you are, traveling together, we could issue it as a single upgrade. Since first class has additional space, you could share the seat. Josephine blinked. Share the seat? The agent's cheeks reddened. Not literally, ma'am, But you'd need to present yourselves as a couple. Officially, the upgrade is for passengers traveling together." It took a moment for the words to register, and when they did, Josephine's mouth opened in disbelief. "You want us to pretend to be a couple?" Beside her, Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and even. "That's ridiculous." "Sir, I understand. But it's the only way we can accommodate both passengers tonight," the agent replied, his tone edged with the politeness of someone who had dealt with one too many disgruntled travelers. Josephine turned to Daniel then, sizing him up properly for the first time. He looked polite enough, his posture slightly stiff, his hands now resting in his pockets. His sandy hair was neatly combed, and there was something kind in the set of his features, though his expression was neutral. He didn't seem thrilled by the suggestion, but he didn't seem to want to give up his seat either. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "do you have a better idea?" Daniel glanced at her, his brows furrowing slightly. "We could wait for the next flight." "I can't wait for the next flight," Josephine said sharply. "I have to be in Portland tonight. It's not optional." His jaw tightened. "Neither can I." The agent cleared his throat tentatively, pulling their attention back to him. "If it helps, first-class seats are wider, and you'll have more privacy. You won't have to interact much." Josephine groaned inwardly, already seeing where this was headed. She wasn't thrilled about the idea of pretending to be in a relationship with a complete stranger, but she also couldn't risk missing this flight. She glanced at Daniel again, hoping he'd magically come up with a solution that didn't involve play acting. Instead, he scratched the back of his neck, his discomfort evident. "This is absurd," he muttered. "You're not wrong," Josephine agreed, exhaling heavily. "But it's what we've got." She could see the hesitation flickering across his face, and for a brief moment she thought he might walk away and leave her to deal with the mess alone. But then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Fine," he said quietly. "We'll do it." Josephine blinked in surprise, not expecting him to cave so quickly. "Fine?" "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. His eyes were a soft shade of hazel, and there was a steadiness to them that caught her off guard. "If it gets us both on the flight, then fine." The agent, clearly relieved, hurried to process their new boarding passes. "Thank you both for your cooperation," he said, though his tone suggested he was more grateful for the reprieve from their debate than anything else. As they waited, Josephine turned back to Daniel. "For the record, I'm not thrilled about this either," she said, folding her arms. "Noted," he replied, his tone neutral. She frowned, biting back a retort. This wasn't the time to pick a fight, no matter how tempted she was. "Well," she said, after an awkward pause, "I guess we should figure out how we're going to sell this." Daniel raised a brow. "Sell what?" "This," she said, gesturing between them. "The whole couple thing, if we're going to pull this off, we'll need to look convincing." His brow furrowed again, but he nodded. "Right, convincing." Josephine couldn't tell if his reluctance was due to shyness or sheer stubbornness, but either way, his hesitation wasn't helping. "Okay, let's keep it simple," she said, trying to take control of the situation. "We don't need a whole backstory or anything. Let's just say we're dating." "Fine," he said again, his tone clipped. "Do you even know how to act like you're dating someone?" she asked, her frustration slipping through. His lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if he were suppressing a smile. "I think I can manage. Can you?" Josephine narrowed her eyes at him, but before she could respond, the agent handed over their new tickets. "Here you go," he said, beaming. "Enjoy your flight." Josephine snatched her ticket and turned to Daniel. "Let's just get this over with." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and together they headed toward the boarding line. As they walked side by side, the awkwardness between them felt almost tangible. Josephine tried not to dwell on it, but she couldn't help wondering how she'd managed to end up in such a ridiculous situation. One thing was certain, this was going to be a very, very long flight. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as Josephine shifted uncomfortably in her plush first-class seat. She wasn't used to this kind of luxury while traveling. Her museum's budget typically covered cramped economy seats and a pretzel bag if she was lucky. But despite the extra space and cushioned leather armrests, she couldn't relax. Not with Daniel sitting beside her, his posture stiff, and his silence louder than the steady roar beyond the windows. She stole a sideways glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight and hands resting deliberately on his lap, as though he didn't quite know what to do with them. Though they'd agreed to the ridiculous charade, the reality of selling themselves as a couple suddenly felt daunting. How were they supposed to pretend to be affectionate when they could barely make eye contact? The flight attendant approached with a warm smile, breaking the tension. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs." She glanced down at the manifest. "Ah, Hayes, welcome aboard. Can I get you two a drink to start?" Josephine almost corrected her on the name before remembering the tickets. "Oh, she hesitated, glancing at Daniel. "Just water for me." "Same," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. The attendant nodded and disappeared, leaving the silence to creep back between them. Josephine leaned forward, pretending to search for something in her tote bag, but really, she just needed a moment to compose herself. When she sat back, she decided to break the ice, if only to make the hours ahead less unbearable. "Well," she said, her voice low, "we're off to a great start as a couple, don't you think?" Daniel turned to look at her, one brow lifting ever so slightly. "What exactly were you expecting?" She shrugged, trying to keep the mood light. "I don't know, maybe a little less tension. Couples in first class are supposed to look like they're enjoying themselves, not plotting an escape." To her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough. "I don't think anyone's paying that much attention to us," he replied. "Besides, I'm not exactly an actor." "No kidding," she said with a teasing smirk. That earned her a brief glance, and for the first time, she noticed a flicker of humor in his hazel eyes. It softened his features, made him seem less guarded. Emboldened, she pressed on. "Okay, here's a thought," she said, leaning slightly closer. "If we're going to pull this off, we should at least try to look like we like each other. You know, for appearances." "Appearances," he echoed, his voice skeptical. "Yes," she said firmly. "Like if the flight attendant comes back, maybe we should act the part." He frowned, considering this. "And what exactly does acting the part involve?" She gestured vaguely between them. "I don't know. Maybe some light conversation? Smiling? You could loosen up a little." Daniel tilted his head as though weighing her words. "All right," he said after a pause. "Light conversation, smiling. Got it." Josephine blinked. She hadn't expected him to agree so easily. "Really?" "Sure," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Why not?" The challenge in his tone made her bristle slightly, but she pushed past it. If he was going to play along, she would too. She crossed one leg over the other and turned toward him, forcing her best couple-enjoying first-class smile. "So, Daniel," she began, her voice sweet and playful, "tell me something about yourself. What's your favorite color?" He quirked a brow at her. "My favorite color?" "It's called small talk," she said with mock seriousness. "You should try it sometime." His lips twitched again, and this time she could almost swear it was a real smile. "Green," he said simply. "Yours?" "Blue," she replied easily. "See, this isn't so hard." He shook his head slightly, though the humor in his expression lingered. "You're surprisingly persistent, you know that?" "I've been told," she said with a grin. "Comes with the job." "Which is what again?" he asked, his tone curious now. "You mentioned something about needing to get to Portland for work." "I'm a museum curator," she said. "Well, an assistant curator, technically. I specialize in antiquities. There's a piece waiting for me in Portland, a rare artifact that might belong to a collection I've been cataloging." "Impressive," he said, and this time his voice carried genuine interest. "You must really love what you do." "I do," Josephine admitted, her smile softening. "It's exhausting sometimes, but it's worth it. What about you? You said you couldn't wait until tomorrow either. What's so important in Portland?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to his hands. For a moment, she thought he might brush off the question, but then he answered, "I'm a veterinarian. There's a conference in Portland, a chance to meet with potential investors. I've been trying to expand my clinic for months, and this could be my best shot." Josephine tilted her head, studying him. "A vet, huh? I wouldn't have guessed that." "Why not?" he asked, his tone vaguely defensive. "I don't know," she said honestly. "You just seem quiet. I guess I thought vets would need to be more outgoing since, they work with people as much as animals." He shrugged. "Animals are easier." She laughed softly at that. Fair enough. For the first time since they'd met, the tension between them seemed to ease. Their conversation drifted into safer territory. Favorite books, travel mishaps, the merits of window seats versus aisle seats. And Josephine found herself surprised by how easy it was to talk to him once his guard was down. He wasn't just polite, he was thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard in the best way. By the time their meals arrived, they were no longer strangers forced into a shared predicament. They weren't quite friends either, but there was something between them now, a tentative connection that made the absurdity of their situation feel almost bearable. As Josephine picked at her salad, she glanced at Daniel again, feeling a pang of unexpected gratitude. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all. The moment the plane touched down in Portland, Josephine felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The soft bump of the wheels against the runway was like a signal that this surreal ordeal was finally over. As the cabin lights brightened, she glanced sideways at Daniel, who was methodically stowing away the book he'd been reading during the descent. His calm movements felt strangely final, like he was already mentally preparing to say goodbye. The two of them waited in awkward silence as the first-class passengers around them began gathering their belongings. Josephine busied herself with her tote bag, fishing out her phone to check the time. She had barely 2 hours to check into her hotel and head to the museum where the artifact awaited. Her pulse quickened at the thought, but she forced herself to take a steadying breath. She was here. She'd made it. That was all that mattered. "Looks like we survived," Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence. Josephine looked up, startled by the sound of his voice. His tone was casual, but there was a faint flicker of amusement in his hazel eyes. She allowed herself a small smile. Barely. He tilted his head, his lips twitching into what might have been a grin, and for a moment she saw the same humor and warmth from their conversation earlier in the flight. But before she could say anything else, the flight attendant's polite announcement rang through the cabin, instructing passengers to gather their belongings and disembark. The moment passed, and Daniel stood, reaching for the overhead compartment to grab his bag. Josephine stayed in her seat, watching as he slung the strap over his shoulder and adjusted it. "Well," she said, standing and clutching the handle of her tote bag, "thanks for going along with all of that. The whole pretending thing. I know it was ridiculous." He turned toward her, his expression softening. "It wasn't so bad. I think we pulled it off." She chuckled lightly, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. "Let's hope no one writes a tell-all about us." This time, his smile was faint but genuine. "If they do, we'll just blame the airline." The aisle began to clear as the other passengers exited the plane, and the two of them fell into step, moving toward the exit. The air in the jet bridge was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of diesel fuel and asphalt. Neither of them said anything as they walked, the sound of their footsteps blending with the chatter of other passengers. When they reached the gate, they slowed and Josephine shifted her weight awkwardly. This was it, the place where their strange, hastily constructed partnership would end. She wasn't sure what to say, if anything. "Thank you? Goodbye? See you never?" "Well," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, "good luck with the artifact." "Good luck with your investors," Josephine replied, offering him a small smile. He nodded, and for a moment it seemed like he might say more, but instead he adjusted the strap of his bag again and gestured toward the terminal. "Take care, Josephine." "You too," she said, and then just like that he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Josephine stood there for a moment, feeling an inexplicable pang of something she couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or the faintest hint of disappointment. Shaking her head, she adjusted her bag and turned in the opposite direction. She had places to be, responsibilities waiting. There was no time to dwell on fleeting encounters with strangers. Still, as she made her way through the terminal, weaving between hurried travelers and families lugging suitcases, she couldn't help glancing back once, just in case. But Daniel was already gone. The food court was alive with chaos. An orchestra of clinking cutlery, the low hum of chatter, and the sharp sizzle of grills from the surrounding stalls. Josephine stood at the edge of it all, clutching a tray with a salad and iced tea, scanning for a seat. Every table seemed claimed, occupied by families with strollers, teenagers glued to their phones, or office workers picking at their lunches between tired conversations. She exhaled, shifting her weight, debating whether to just eat standing against a wall. "Excuse me, miss, you're blocking the line," someone muttered behind her. Startled, she shuffled to the side, her cheeks flushing. Great. She was already late to meet a colleague at the gallery, and now this. Her eyes landed on a small, half-empty table near the corner. A single occupant sat there, a man leaning slightly over his plate of pasta, head bowed as he scrolled through his phone. The sight of him seemed to pull the air from the room. She blinked, and her chest tightened with recognition. Daniel. Of all the food courts in the city. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure why. It wasn't as though she hadn't been able to stop thinking about their strange encounter on the plane. Of course, she had chalked it up to exhaustion and the fleeting nature of travel, nothing more than a peculiar memory. Now, though, seeing him again, something stirred in her, not just surprise, but a flicker of warmth she hadn't expected. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward. "Daniel?" His head snapped up at the sound of his name. He froze, his phone forgotten in his hand, as his hazel eyes met hers. For a beat, he looked as unsure as she felt, but then his lips curved into a small, surprised smile. "Josephine." "Hi," she said, suddenly aware of how awkward she must look, clutching her tray like a lifeline. I didn't think I'd see you again." "Same," he replied, his tone soft, measured. His gaze flicked to her tray, then back to her face. "You looking for a seat?" "Desperately," she admitted, laughing nervously. "This place is a jungle." He nodded toward the empty chair across from him. "You're welcome to join me." "Thanks." She slid into the chair, setting her tray down carefully. For a moment, they both busied themselves with their food. She mixed her salad absently, while he twirled his fork through the remnants of his pasta. The silence wasn't tense, exactly, but it was charged, like neither of them knew quite where to begin. "So," Daniel said finally, leaning back in his chair, "how's the artifact?" His question caught her by surprise, and she looked up, smiling despite herself. "You remembered? I figured it was important, given how determined you were to make that flight." She laughed softly. "It was, and it's incredible, actually. Turns out it's older than we thought. Likely part of a lost dynasty we've been researching for years." "I'm still in awe. We managed to bring it back safely." "That's great," he said, and the approval in his voice felt genuine. "Sounds like it was worth all the chaos." She tilted her head, studying him. "What about you? Did the trip help with your investors?" His expression shifted, a mixture of pride and relief. "It did, actually. I've got 2 solid leads for funding. If all goes well, I might be able to expand the clinic by the end of the year." "That's amazing," she said, her smile widening. "Congratulations, Daniel, really." "Thanks." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "I guess we both got what we needed." "Guess so," she murmured, though there was something wistful in her tone. For a moment, their encounter on the plane felt like it had happened years ago. 2 people thrown together by chance, each with their own directions to go. And yet, here they were again. The conversation drifted naturally after that, the initial awkwardness dissolving as they talked about work, the city, even the absurdity of the food court's endless lines. Daniel's dry humor surfaced again, and Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in days. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed their strange, easy rhythm until now. At one point, a passing couple bumped into their table, jolting Josephine's iced tea dangerously close to the edge. Daniel's hand shot out, steadying it before it could tip over. "Careful," he said, his tone light, though his hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," she said softly, meeting his gaze. The noise of the food court seemed to fade for a second, leaving just the 2 of them and the unspoken question hanging between them. Was this another fleeting moment or something more? "Josephine," Daniel said suddenly, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "I don't know if this is weird, but would you want to share lunch again sometime?" she finished for him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. His brows lifted in mild surprise, but then he chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Yeah, something like that." She tilted her head, pretending to think it over. "I suppose I could pencil you in." "Generous of you," he said with a faint grin. They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and as Josephine walked out of the food court, her tote slung over one shoulder, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Maybe this wasn't just another fleeting moment. Maybe, just maybe, fate had more in store for them. The sound of ceramic cups clinking and the low murmur of conversation filled the cozy cafe. Josephine sat across from Daniel, her hands curled around a steaming mug of chai latte. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, draping soft golden light across the table between them. It had been his suggestion to meet here, someplace quieter than the bustling food court where they'd crossed paths again. She'd been surprised he'd followed through, but pleasantly so. "So," Josephine said, leaning back slightly in her chair. "A veterinarian, huh? That still doesn't explain why you were rushing across the country last week, unless Portland is known for some sort of world-famous animal clinic investors." Daniel gave a small chuckle, the kind of low, understated laugh she was starting to associate with him. "Not exactly, but there was a conference, a sort of mixer to meet people who might be willing to fund the expansion I've been working on." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee mug. "I've been running my clinic for a few years now, but I want to grow, create a sanctuary for animals with more critical needs. It's a lot to take on, though. Funding's always the tricky part." Josephine nodded, impressed despite herself. There was something steady about Daniel, something rooted. He spoke about his work with a quiet confidence that made it clear how deeply he cared about it. "Sounds like a big deal," she said, feeling a small, unexpected pang of admiration. "How'd it go?" "Well enough," he replied, though the faint furrow in his brow gave him away. "I made a couple of contacts, but there's still a lot riding on an upcoming gala next weekend." "A gala?" She arched a brow, smiling. "Fancy. Do you own a tux?" Daniel rolled his eyes faintly, but smirked. "Yes, I own a tux, believe it or not," she laughed, taking a sip of her chai. "And what happens at this gala? Are you going to charm the investors with your passion for saving puppies and kittens?" "Essentially," he said, his expression softening. "It's more formal than I'm used to, but it's a good opportunity to pitch the clinic's future to people who might actually care." He hesitated, his gaze flicking down to his coffee. "There's just one catch." Josephine tilted her head, suddenly intrigued. "What kind of catch?" He exhaled, almost like he was reluctant to admit it. "The gala is technically for invited professionals and their partners. It's not a requirement to bring someone, but..." He stopped, rubbing at the back of his neck. "Let's just say the organizers have strongly encouraged it. Makes us look more relatable or grounded, I guess." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "Let me get this straight. They're asking you to pitch how serious you are about saving animals, and they think you'll be more convincing if you show up with a date?" Daniel's lips quirked in that almost smile of his. "Something like that." "That's absurd." "Completely," he agreed, though there was a note of resignation in his voice. She watched him for a moment, his shoulders faintly hunched and that guarded expression creeping back into place. There it was again, that stubborn independence she'd noticed in him before, the way he seemed to shoulder everything on his own. She didn't know what exactly prompted her next words, but they tumbled out before she could think twice. "I'll go with you." Daniel froze, his gaze snapping up to meet hers. "What?" "I'll go with you," she repeated, more firmly this time. She set her mug down, leaning forward slightly. "It's not like we haven't faked this before. We've already been a couple once. What's one more time?" His expression was a mix of surprise and hesitation, like he wasn't sure if she was joking. "Josephine, thank you, but you don't have to do that. It's not your problem." She waved his words away. "I know I don't have to, but it sounds important to you, and I like a good excuse to get dressed up." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a moment it looked like he might argue, but then he shook his head and let out a breath of what sounded suspiciously like relief. "You're serious?" "Completely," she said with a grin. "Besides, you already know I'm great at pretending to be your girlfriend." Daniel huffed a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "I don't know if great is the word I'd use." "Careful," she teased, pointing a finger at him. "You're going to lose your date if you keep that up." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that softened his whole face. "Thank you," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice, something genuine that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Really, I appreciate it." "Don't mention it," she said, brushing it off with a wave. "Just promise me there'll be decent food at this thing." "I'll see what I can do," he replied, his tone lighter now. As they lapsed into easier conversation, Josephine couldn't help but notice how the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, how his smile lingered just a little longer. She didn't know what made her step into his world like this, but something told her she wouldn't regret it. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. Not for work, not for obligation, but simply because she wanted to. And that felt surprisingly good. The grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of 1,000 tiny lights, each one reflected in the polished marble floors. Chandeliers hung like delicate sculptures from the high ceiling, and the soft hum of conversation filled the space, mingling with the elegant strains of a string quartet. Josephine adjusted the strap of her dark green satin dress, a quiet nervousness buzzing through her chest as she glanced at her reflection in one of the ornate mirrors lining the walls. She looked poised, confident even, but inside she wasn't so sure. Beside her, Daniel stood in a sharp black tuxedo that fit him so well it almost erased the image of the quiet, slightly awkward man she'd first met at the airport. Almost. He shifted his weight, tugging at his cufflink absent-mindedly, and Josephine caught the faint tension in his jaw. He was nervous. It was subtle, but she could see it in the way his shoulders were just a little too stiff, the way his eyes scanned the room, calculating. She leaned closer, their reflection catching in the mirror as she whispered, "Relax. You look fine." He glanced at her, a corner of his mouth twitching in something like a smile. "That obvious, huh?" "A little," she admitted, her tone light but reassuring. "Just breathe. You're here to talk about something you care about. That's what matters." Daniel nodded, exhaling softly. "Right. Breathe." They stepped further into the room together, their pace slow and deliberate. Josephine slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, not because she needed to, but because it felt right, like a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone in this. He glanced down at her hand, then back up, his hazel eyes softening for a moment before he straightened his shoulders. As they moved toward one of the clusters of impeccably dressed attendees, Josephine kept her smile warm but neutral, the way she'd practiced countless times at museum fundraisers. She scanned the sea of faces, noting the way some turned toward Daniel with polite curiosity. These were the people he needed to win over tonight, the investors who could help him expand his clinic and create the sanctuary he'd been dreaming of. She could feel the weight of his purpose in the way he carried himself, quiet but steady, like a man walking a tightrope. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit approached them, his expression friendly but measured. "Dr. Cole, good to see you again," he said, holding out a hand. "Mr. Bennett," Daniel replied, shaking it firmly. His voice was calm even, but Josephine caught the flicker of tension in his posture. "Thank you for having me tonight." "And who is this?" Bennett's gaze shifted to Josephine, his smile widening slightly. Josephine stepped forward smoothly, offering her hand. "Josephine Hayes," she said, her tone warm and polished. "Daniel's partner. It's a pleasure to meet you." Bennett's brows lifted slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Ah, lovely to meet you as well." He turned back to Daniel, gesturing toward the group he'd just left. "We were just discussing potential opportunities in community outreach. I think you'd find it interesting. Care to join us?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze flicking to Josephine as if silently asking if she'd be all right. She gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "Go," she murmured. "I'll be fine." He nodded, his expression grateful, and let Bennett lead him toward the group. Josephine watched him go, her fingers still warm from where they'd touched his arm. She let herself linger near the edges of the room, observing as Daniel immersed himself in conversation. His usual quiet demeanor transformed as he spoke about his clinic, his hands moving just slightly when he described his vision. There was a passion in his voice that was magnetic, drawing people closer, their heads nodding in interest. It was the first time Josephine had seen him like this, fully in his element, and it struck her in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't have long to think, though, as she spotted a familiar face across the room, her ex-fiancé, Evan. He was laughing with a group of well-dressed patrons, his easy charm on display. Her stomach tightened. This was supposed to be her event. Daniel might have needed tonight to impress investors, but she needed it to prove, to herself and maybe to Evan, that she'd moved on, that she wasn't the woman who'd been left behind. As if sensing her unease, Daniel reappeared at her side, his approach silent but grounding. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She turned to him, startled by the question. "What? Oh, yeah, I'm fine." His eyes flicked briefly to the group across the room to Evan. "That him?" Josephine blinked, surprised he'd put it together so quickly. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's him." Daniel studied her for a moment, then offered his arm again. "Come on." She hesitated, but the steadiness in his gaze gave her the confidence she needed. She slipped her hand back into the crook of his arm, and together they walked toward the center of the room, where Evan's laughter echoed. As they approached, Evan noticed them, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Josephine," he said, his tone smooth but curious, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She smiled, cool and composed. "Evan, always a pleasure." "And who's this?" Evan's gaze shifted to Daniel, his expression sharp with interest. "Daniel Cole," Daniel said, his tone polite but firm. He didn't offer more, didn't need to. His presence alone made a statement. Evan's eyes lingered on Daniel for a moment too long, then flicked back to Josephine. "Well, I'm glad to see you're doing well." Josephine's grip on Daniel's arm tightened slightly, but she refused to let Evan's words rattle her. "I am," she said simply, her smile unwavering. "Very well." Daniel glanced down at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips as if to say, "You've got this." For the rest of the evening, they navigated the event side by side. Daniel supporting her when her nerves wavered, Josephine stepping in to ease him into conversations when he faltered. It was a partnership unlike anything either of them had known before, built on quiet understanding and mutual respect. By the time the night ended, their roles as pretend partners felt less like a performance and more like something real. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth as Josephine and Daniel stood at the edge of a winding trail, the sunlight dappling through the canopy above. Daniel adjusted his backpack, eyeing the steep incline in front of them with visible skepticism. "You're sure about this?" he asked, glancing at Josephine. Her wide grin was unmistakable. "Absolutely. It's just a short hike. Nothing you can't handle, Dr. Cole." "I work with animals," he deadpanned. "Not mountains." Josephine laughed, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "Come on, it'll be good for you. Get some fresh air, clear your head. You can't spend all your time in the clinic or at investor meetings. Besides," she gestured to the trail ahead, "look at that view." Daniel followed her gaze to the rolling hills stretching toward the horizon, dusted with amber and scarlet leaves. He exhaled, reluctant but resigned. "Fine, but if I break an ankle, you're carrying me back." "Deal," she said, her eyes twinkling as she started up the trail. As they climbed, the silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Occasionally, Josephine would point out something, a bird flitting through the trees, a cluster of wildflowers clinging to the trail's edge, and Daniel would respond with soft amusement or mild curiosity. "Why do I feel like you've done this 1,000,000 times?" Daniel asked after a while, sidestepping a stray root. "My dad used to take me hiking when I was a kid," she said, her voice warm with nostalgia. "I hated it back then, thought it was boring. But now, I don't know. It helps me breathe when life gets too chaotic." Daniel nodded, filing that piece of her away. "I can see that." They reached a clearing at the summit where the world seemed to open up around them. Josephine dropped her bag and stretched her arms wide, inhaling deeply. Daniel, less dramatically, sat on a nearby rock. "You're not bad at this," she teased, watching as he took in the view. "Don't get used to it," he replied, though his tone lacked its usual edge. Josephine smiled, sitting beside him. "You know, you should take more time for yourself. You're always focused on work." Daniel gave her a sideways glance. "And you're not. You practically live at the museum." She laughed softly, nudging him again. "Tache." For a moment, they sat in companionable quiet, the wind brushing against them. "You're good at this," Daniel said finally, his voice softer now. Josephine raised a brow. "Good at what?" "Making people feel lighter," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but his words meant for her. She blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Well," she said after a pause, her tone playful to mask the sudden warmth in her chest, "someone's got to keep you grounded." Daniel smiled, small, subtle, but real. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt like they were carrying the weight of the world alone. The quiet hum of the gallery's evening event settled around them, soft, classical music playing in the background as Josephine adjusted her earring in the reflection of a gilded mirror. The museum fundraiser was in full swing, patrons mingling and clinking glasses of champagne under the warm glow of the chandelier. Across the room, Daniel stood near the hors d'oeuvres table, looking slightly out of place among the polished crowd, but managing to blend in with his quiet confidence. Josephine smiled faintly at the sight of him and turned back to the mirror, straightening the neckline of her dress. Tonight wasn't about them. It was about the museum raising enough funds to secure the traveling exhibit she'd been working toward for months. Still, knowing Daniel was here, even just as her date, grounded her. "Josephine," a familiar voice rang out behind her, bright and sharp. She turned to see Karen approaching with a wide grin, her red lipstick as vibrant as ever. Karen, the smooth-talking event planner who always seemed to know everyone's business, had been instrumental in coordinating both this fundraiser and the gala Daniel had attended days earlier. She was a shared connection, though Josephine couldn't quite recall how their worlds had first overlapped. "Karen," Josephine greeted warmly, though something in Karen's energy tonight felt slightly off. Her movements were too quick, her gaze darting around the room like she was keeping track of too many moving pieces. "You look stunning," Karen said, her voice smooth, "and Daniel looks utterly dashing. A perfect couple, honestly." Josephine's smile tightened. "Well, thanks, but you know it's not like that." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, details? What matters is appearances, right? Speaking of which." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice lowering. "Have you heard about Evan's little incident?" Karen's eyes glittered with a strange kind of satisfaction, but Josephine barely processed her words. Her attention had shifted to Daniel, who was now walking toward them, his face unusually tense. "Josephine," Daniel said without preamble, his voice low. "Can we talk?" Karen raised a perfectly arched brow. "Trouble in paradise?" she teased, but Daniel ignored her, his hand lightly brushing Josephine's elbow as he guided her a few steps away. "What's wrong?" Josephine asked, concern flickering in her chest. Daniel glanced back at Karen, who was now chatting with a group nearby, her laughter carrying above the hum of the room. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just overheard something. One of the investors at the gala mentioned that Karen tipped them off about my clinic." Josephine frowned, confused. "Tipped them off about what?" "She told them my plans to expand were unrealistic and implied I didn't have the expertise to pull it off," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "She's been undermining me." "What?" Josephine hissed, her pulse quickening. "Why would she do that?" Daniel's expression darkened. "I don't know, but it gets worse. The investor mentioned your museum. She's been spreading rumors about your artifact acquisition process, suggesting there were ethical oversights." The words hit Josephine like a slap, her breath catching in her throat. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. "We followed every protocol." "Exactly," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "She's playing both sides, undermining you at the museum while sabotaging my credibility with investors." Josephine's mind raced, a whirlwind of conversations and moments with Karen flashing through her memory. She thought of the way Karen had pushed her to invite Evan tonight, insisting it would be good closure. The way Karen had smoothed over Daniel's invite to the gala, claiming it was for networking. It all felt so calculated now. "We need to confront her," Josephine said firmly, her eyes narrowing. Daniel nodded, his gaze locking with hers. Together, they turned back toward Karen, whose laughter was still ringing out, oblivious to the storm heading her way. The chandelier overhead gleamed coldly, its light refracting off the crystal glasses and polished silverware scattered across the room. The hum of conversation provided a deceptive sense of calm, an elegant facade that masked the tension building between Josephine and Daniel as they moved purposefully toward Karen. Side by side, their strides matched, their expressions resolute. Karen stood near a small cluster of patrons, her laughter sharp and melodic, echoing above the murmur of the crowd. She gestured theatrically with one hand, a flute of champagne balanced in the other, her charisma as effortless as ever. But as Josephine and Daniel drew closer, her eyes flicked toward them, and her laughter faltered just slightly. "Josephine, Daniel," Karen greeted brightly, recovering within a heartbeat. She turned to the group with an exaggerated smile. "Excuse us, won't you? Duty calls." With practiced ease, she slipped away from her audience and focused her full attention on them. "What can I do for my favorite duo?" Josephine didn't smile. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through Karen's charm. Karen's brow lifted in mock concern. "Oh dear, that doesn't sound good. Is something wrong?" "Stop," Daniel said quietly, his tone steely. Karen blinked at him, perhaps surprised by his directness. "We know what you've been doing." Karen's polished facade slipped for a fraction of a second, a twitch of her lips, a flicker of something defensive in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a light laugh. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "You do," Josephine said firmly, stepping closer. Her voice didn't waver. "We know you've been sabotaging both of us, undermining Daniel's clinic at the gala, spreading lies about my work at the museum. Don't pretend otherwise." Karen tilted her head, the smile on her lips turning razor thin. "Sabotage?" she repeated, feigning innocence. "That's a strong word, don't you think?" "It's accurate," Daniel said, his gaze unflinching. "I heard you. You told the investors my expansion plans were unrealistic. You deliberately cast doubt on my credibility. Why?" Karen's eyes widened, but not with guilt. No, it was something closer to irritation, like a magician caught mid-trick. "Daniel," she said with a sigh, her tone shifting to something clipped, "I wasn't undermining you. I know how these people think. I was trying to manage their expectations for you, keeping them from expecting too much too soon. I was helping you." "Helping?" Daniel's voice hardened, a sharp edge cutting through Karen's excuse. "You don't get to frame this as a favor. You painted me as incompetent to the very people I was trying to impress." "And what about the museum?" Josephine pressed, her voice rising slightly. Anger simmered beneath her composure, her hands tightly clutching the glittering clutch at her side. "You spread lies about my team's acquisition process. Why would you do that, Karen? What do you gain from sabotaging us?" Karen didn't answer immediately. Her mouth tightened, her gaze flitting between them like she was calculating her next move. When she finally spoke, there was no pretense of warmth in her voice anymore, only cold practicality. "You're both so quick to jump to conclusions," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "But fine. You want honesty? Here it is. The museum's exhibit is a direct competitor to another show I've been working on. I may have nudged a few rumors along to ensure my clients had the advantage in securing funding. And as for the clinic," she turned to Daniel, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Investors are a limited resource. If they're distracted by overambitious projects like yours, they're less likely to focus on the more realistic opportunities I've been curating for them." Josephine's breath caught, the sheer audacity of Karen's admission momentarily stunning her. But Daniel didn't waver. He stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "So this was all about money, positioning yourself as the gatekeeper for these investors, no matter who you hurt in the process." Karen gave a small shrug, as though the answer were obvious. "It's business. You wouldn't understand." "That's where you're wrong," Josephine said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass shattering. She took another step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Daniel. "This isn't business. This is manipulation. You took our trust, our work, our reputations, and used them for your own gain. That's not business. It's betrayal." Karen's expression cracked for the first time, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Josephine, let's not make this personal." "It is personal," Josephine snapped. Her pulse raced, but her voice remained steady, controlled. "You didn't just attack our work. You attacked who we are, and we won't stand by and let it continue." Daniel nodded, his gaze locked on Karen. "We're going to make sure every investor and patron you've lied to knows the truth. And when they do, you'll lose the credibility you worked so hard to manipulate." Karen's face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. You're making a mistake, she said coldly. No, Josephine replied, her voice firm and unwavering. You did. Karen stared at them for a long moment, but when it was clear neither of them would back down, she huffed softly and turned on her heel, disappearing into the crowd. As the tension eased, Josephine let out a shaky breath, glancing at Daniel. Well, she said with a faint, wry smile, that went about as well as it could have. Daniel's own smile was small but steady. Thank you for standing with me. Always, Josephine said softly, and for the first time the weight of the betrayal didn't feel so heavy, because they hadn't faced it alone. The moving truck rumbled off into the distance, leaving behind a quiet stillness that wrapped itself around the small cottage like a comforting embrace. Josephine stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, her hands on her hips, taking in the sight before her. The house was modest, its white paint slightly weathered from years of standing against the elements, but the porch was sturdy, and the flower boxes beneath the windows were overgrown with the promise of life. Beyond the house, the rolling hills stretched out in waves of green and gold, dotted with tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. It's not much, Daniel said behind her, his tone hesitant but hopeful. She turned to see him standing a few steps away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked out toward the horizon, his eyes unreadable, as if bracing for her reaction. It's perfect, she said simply, a smile tugging at her lips. He glanced at her, the tension easing from his shoulders. You think so? I know so. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the gravel, and touched his arm lightly. Look around, Daniel. No deadlines, no city noise, no one breathing down our necks. Just this. She gestured toward the land, her voice soft with wonder. How could it not be perfect? The corners of his mouth lifted into a small, genuine smile, and he looked back at the cottage. I guess I'll have to take your word for it. Josephine laughed, the sound light and easy, and leaned into his side. You'll see, once we get everything set up, the sanctuary, the gallery, it'll feel like home. Daniel looked down at her, his hazel eyes warm. Home, he repeated, the word sounding unfamiliar but full of possibility. They stood together in comfortable silence, the breeze carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and pine. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet unfolding of a new beginning. Josephine slipped her hand into his, her fingers curling around his, and gave him a gentle squeeze. Ready to build something that's ours? She asked, her voice steady and sure. Daniel nodded, his smile widening. With you? Always. The scent of fresh hay mingled with the faint, earthy aroma of clay as Josephine carefully positioned the final piece of pottery on the wooden shelf. The light from the tall windows spilled across the room, catching the glaze and highlighting its soft green hue, the exact shade of the hills rolling just beyond the sanctuary. She stepped back and tilted her head, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her lips. From outside came the soft, familiar sounds of the sanctuary waking to life. The gentle bleating of sheep, the low whinny of a horse, and the happy yips of a dog chasing the morning sun. Josephine glanced through the open doorway and saw Daniel kneeling on the grass, one hand steadying a young goat as he inspected its hoof. His sandy brown hair caught in the breeze, and he paused to say something to the animal, his voice soft and reassuring, bringing a faint warmth to her chest. The gallery space, once just a vague dream, was finally coming together. The walls had been painted a creamy white, allowing the local art to take center stage. Pottery, paintings, and woven textiles from nearby artists filled the shelves and adorned the walls, their colors bright and full of life. Each piece told a story, much like each animal they'd rescued. It was a space that felt alive, a blend of her passion for history and art, and his commitment to healing and nurturing. Together, they'd made something that felt undeniably theirs. Hey! Daniel's voice brought her back to the present. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his boots dusted with dirt and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. In his arms was a small calico cat, its green eyes blinking lazily in the sunlight. I think someone's already claimed the best spot in the house. He nodded toward the gallery counter, where the cat stretched luxuriously before curling into a ball. Josephine laughed, crossing the room to join him. Well, she has good taste, That's prime gallery real estate. She scratched the cat gently behind the ears before looking back at Daniel. How's everyone settling in this morning? Good, he said, his voice steady but warm. The goats are happy, the horses are grazing, and Annie, he nodded toward the dog, sprawled in a patch of sunlight by the barn door, has declared herself queen of the sanctuary. Josephine grinned. As she should. Daniel shifted slightly, his hand brushing hers as he set the cat down on the counter. And you? How are you feeling about all this? His hazel eyes searched hers, the question as much about her as it was about the sanctuary. She took a deep breath, letting her gaze sweep over the gallery and out the window to the sanctuary beyond. It's more than I ever imagined, she said honestly, her voice soft. It's home. Daniel smiled, his hand finding hers and lacing their fingers together. Yeah, he said quietly. It really is. And as the morning stretched on, filled with the sounds of rescued animals finding peace and local art coming to life, the two of them stood together, their dreams no longer separate, but intertwined in a way that felt like forever.